but
sometimes just walk away because it's easier for me to put this aside.
All right, we have people joining us, so we're going to get started momentarily. Great to see so many of you this afternoon.
It's hard.
Happy New Year, by the way. We hope you're all well. Anne-Marie, there's a lot of interest in this topic today, no doubt.
Yeah, I'm sure there is.
Leave
it to me to make everybody even more paranoid.
We'll just give it a second here. Okay.
you can go ahead.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Deb Newman, President and CEO of the Bangor Region Chamber of Commerce, here with Shelley Sund, our Director of Marketing and Events, and our wonderful partners at Rudman Winchell, Anne-Marie Storey and Karen Sichters are joining us this afternoon. And Anne-Marie Storey is here to provide our employment law updates. This is something that we've been doing pretty frequently since March of 2020 when all of this started, and here we are in January 2021, and we're still at it. Obviously a lot has changed, and a big, huge topic of conversation right now is around vaccinations, certainly, and as an employer, what do you need to be thinking about? As an employee, what do you need to be thinking about? And no doubt, Anne-Marie, you're receiving a lot of questions. We're hearing a lot of conversation about this. We have questions. And if you have questions, this is your opportunity to ask your questions. You can ask your question through the Q&A on Zoom. If you're watching us on Facebook, we are live on Facebook. You can message us privately, Bangor Region Chamber of Commerce site, or just post a comment. Shelley Sund will be taking your questions and feeding those to me as we go through the webinar this afternoon. We're planning on 1 hour. We may go a little longer if need be. I know Anne-Marie has a lot to discuss. Happy New Year. Great to see you again.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Good to be back.
And we already have some questions coming in, and quite a few people joining us this afternoon. Why don't you just kick us off with the vaccination conversation, and then we have some other topics we certainly want to touch on today as well.
Yeah, there's quite a bit. There's the vaccinations, and then of course there's the end of the FFCRA as of last week and what that means, and the new tax credit. So I wanted to mention that. And then there's some recent updates from some of the governmental agencies about postings, because we've talked about those in the past and how to disseminate postings to people who aren't in the workplace. So we finally have some definitive guidance about that, and also from the FMLA. But I know everybody wants to hear about vaccinations. So let me just start this off by saying, obviously this is a great thing. I'm not in any way taking away from how super it is that we now have these, or are starting to have them become available. I'm not saying employers shouldn't use them. I'm not saying they shouldn't encourage or require people to have them. As usual, my role is to in some ways be the cynical voice and just make sure that employers understand what they're getting into when we talk about vaccinations and their approach to how to deal with them in the workplace, whether to require them or whether not to require them or encourage them. So that's sort of where I'm coming from in this discussion. Part of the reason this came up not only is because the vaccinations are becoming available, but also because we want people to be prepared, and because the EEOC issued some guidance, I think it was last week or now the week before, about vaccinations. And I saw an awful lot of headlines and a lot of articles, and I was a little bit concerned that people would not have a full picture of what this meant, because basically the EEOC in very broad strokes has said it's okay to require the vaccination. But there's so much more to this than that. And I don't want employers to just say, well, the EEOC said it was okay. I saw that in the headline, so I'm good. Now I'm going to require them. And, that's the end of my liability, because that's not going to be the case. So the first things obviously to talk about, and we've mentioned this before, are, well, number one, would you require them? Are you going to plan to require them? And why would you do that? And I really think employers need to think that through more than just sort of an emotional reaction to, oh my gosh, there's a vaccine, I'm so glad that there is, we'll make the workplace as safe as possible and everybody's going to be required to have one. I mean, arguably, there's an issue about what happens if you don't require them, because this is very much a double-edged sword. So if an employer decides not to require all their employees to have one, is that going to violate OSHA's general duty clause? Because now you know that there is a way to make people as safe as they can possibly be. And if you don't require everybody to have it, then you end up with, ongoing risk in your workplace. And so do you not meet OSHA's general duty clause if you don't require that to happen? We don't have an answer from OSHA yet, so that's one issue. If you do require it, though, you run into the immediate question of what happens if somebody says, I don't want to have it, or I can't have it. Are we still on? We lost you, Deb.
We are. She's just moving. There she is. To
I just
another
want to
room.
make sure I wasn't talking to nothingness. Okay.
No, Anne Marie, you have plenty of people logged in. There's
All right.
800 people
Okay.
here, so.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you never know. I can talk to myself, that's not a problem, but so the question about if I do require the employees to have them, what's going to happen when somebody says, I'm not going to do it? And I wanted to go through that analysis a little bit. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions about that, and we can address those directly as well. But in general terms, and we've said this before, there are at least two protected reasons why someone could say, I'm not going to have it, even though you're saying that you require me to do so. And one of those, of course, is if the person has a medical condition, a disability that would prevent them from having the vaccination. We have heard about allergic reactions. There have been some headlines about people who didn't react well to it. Fortunately, not very many, but it has been reported. And there may be somebody whose doctor says, I don't think you should have the risk of having this shot, in which case an employer just has to be aware that that could be a protected right under the ADA and the Maine Human Rights Act. And in that case, they would have to engage in a reasonable accommodation analysis. And we can talk about what that means. The second reason is if somebody has a religious objection to having a shot. And there are people whose beliefs would dictate to them that they are not going to have any kind of medical treatment at all, or if for whatever reason that's specific to the vaccination, they're not going to have it. Likewise, like the disability, religion is a protected category under the Title VII and the Maine Human Rights Act, and so employers are going to have to engage again in the reasonable accommodation analysis and make a decision about what to do with somebody who will not have a vaccination for that reason. So those are the first two things to be aware of. The next thing is that if you require the vaccination, it's very much the same as the analysis we've talked about in terms of the flu. And that is, if somebody does have a negative reaction to this and gets sick because of the vaccination, or something happens to them because of the vaccination, then that is likely going to be a workers' compensation issue. And you as the employer who required them to have that vaccination is likely going to be responsible for it from a workers' compensation perspective. And again, it's the same analysis we've talked about with the flu. There's a very fine line between requiring or strongly encouraging your employees to have this versus just saying, if you want to have it, great, and we'll even provide it, or we'll have somebody here to give it to you, or whatever the case may be. And if something negative happens, then the administrative law judge will ultimately be called on to make a decision about where that gray area falls, and did you encourage them enough that you're going to be responsible for whatever happened because of it. So let's say you get through all those steps in the analysis and you still have decided we are definitely going to require everybody to have this vaccination. If somebody has a religious or a medical objection to it, we'll deal with that separately. But beyond that, we're in line, we're ready. As soon as they come out, we're going to do this. I wanted to make sure employers understand that there is a very big difference between administering it yourself or having a contractor of your own administer it, like your 10-day provider, versus having somebody go somewhere else to have it, like a pharmacy, or I saw that Hannaford is going to be a place where they're going to be offering them. And that's a very, very important distinction, because as I understand it, and as it's been reported out, there are background questions that whoever is giving this vaccination is going to ask of the person getting it. And those are likely going to elicit some kind of medical history or medical information. So if you as the employer or your contractor, and you have access to that information, were to administer it directly, you would then be in a position of potentially receiving confidential medical information that you are probably not even permitted to have, but even if you could have it because of the vaccination, that you don't want to have. So it's like any other medical examination as defined under the ADA. So if you are going to require that this be done, you need to think about how you do it, and whether or not you want to be the person administering it, or you want to have them go to an outside source to have it done. The other thing that was raised by the EEOC, and this is important, and a lot of employers either forget that this act even exists or not aware of it in the first place, and that is GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And what that means is you are not entitled to have information about somebody's genetic history so that it sets you up for a potential claim of discrimination. You're just not permitted to have that information. And there may be some information in the pre-vaccination questions that elicits information protected by GINA. So that's the other reason why you should not be, or at least you should very strongly consider against administering these yourself or through one of your own providers. So those are just a very few of the general issues that I wanted to raise with vaccination. I'm sure that there are a lot of specific questions about it, and we can go to those right now, Deb, if you want, or I can mention this other things that we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, let's take some of these questions. Shelley will let me know if, and Anne-Marie, let me know if you can hear me okay. We're having some technical challenges on our end. If you can't, let me know. This is an interesting one. The question concerns businesses involved with travel or stadium theater venues that might want to require proof of vaccination before selling a ticket or allowing entrance into an area where social distancing is unfeasible. Do we know the latest on efforts to develop some sort of a vaccine passport?
That's outside of the employment realm, so I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I've seen that raised as an issue, but I don't have any information about that.
Okay, we'll save that one. We are planning to bring Dr. Jarvis to you next week from Northern Light Health to talk more about vaccines from the medical science point of view. So we'll note that as a question for him. You touched on this, but we have several people have been asking if we mandate it as an employee and the employee has a severe reaction, can we be held liable?
Yes. Well, a qualified yes. I mean, the employee could make, because it would likely be because if it's work related, then they are required to file under workers' comp, and that's their limited remedy. So that would be the liability. On the flip side, I suppose, if you did have your own provider or somebody within your place of employment administer it, then you could potentially have some liability in the event that it was improperly administered.
And some of the questions we will are not employment law related, Anne-Marie, so we'll save those for Dr. Jarvis. They're a little more on the science piece, but what issues do you foresee if a company were to provide monetary incentives for employees to be vaccinated?
My immediate reaction is that's not a good idea, because if you have people who cannot be, then you're potentially discriminating against those people based on disability or religion. It's the same as offering incentives in health insurance for people who can't participate in wellness programs and things like that.
There's some questions around what constitutes a medical condition that would constitute an exemption if you mandated. I think you touched on that.
Yeah, so it's the same analysis as any other ADA analysis. So if you were to say to your employees, everybody must receive the vaccination, and I came to you and I said, I have a very severe allergy to eggs, and so I never get these kind of vaccinations because, like, for instance, the flu vaccine is based on eggs or whatever, has some interaction, and so let's say there's some indication that this one is too, and I tell you that if I have it, then I'm going to develop a very serious health condition and, you know, potentially death and all these things. So then I've raised the possibility of having a disability, and you assess that just like you would any other disability. An employer is entitled to ask the person, the employee, for documentation from their physician that you have this condition and that you in fact cannot receive the vaccination. And once you have that, then you move to the next step, which is what kind of reasonable accommodation can we make? So if there is no possible way of them receiving the vaccination, then the next step is you look at your own workplace and you make a determination about, can that person still work there safely? And now, you know, we now know that people can work remotely successfully. And so there's a lot more sort of in the world of possible reasonable accommodation. So maybe that's a person that continues to work remotely forever, or, you know, you have them in a separate area of the workplace. But it's going to depend on each situation, because again, if 99% of the workplace is vaccinated except for this one person, then it seems like that person can't put those other people at risk because they're all vaccinated against it. So, you know, I think I can't say what all the possible accommodations will be, but you just go through exactly the same analysis as you would any other ADA issue. And that's true of religion too.
Right, right. What issues do you foresee if a company were to provide, oh, I asked the one, here it is. If we do move forward offering vaccines, not requiring necessarily, would there be a template waiver form? Should employees be signing some kind of a waiver, some kind of a form?
I think excuse me. I think it depends on who administers it, because if it's an outside entity, chances are they're going to have the employee sign some kind of medical acknowledgement and maybe even a release, just like you would at any other medical care facility. If you're doing it in-house, though, you have to keep in mind that you cannot require or even ask an employee to waive potential workers' compensation rights. And since a negative effect from the vaccination could be covered by workers' comp, I would be very hesitant to ask anybody to sign a waiver for that reason. I mean, probably we could craft one that sort of carved out workers' comp and address other forms of potential liability, and we probably could do that. But you'd have to be careful about that wording.
And that, you know, this is also new for all of us. There's so much that everybody's trying to figure out. What if you have a situation, and again, you may have touched on this, where you have a small office and 3 out of 5 are vaccinated and 2 will not get the vaccine. And the employees who are vaccinated are concerned about working with the non-vaccinated employees. How do you manage that situation?
I mean, you know, again, it's sort of a catch-22, because if the people are vaccinated, then arguably they can't get it. So what would be the valid concern in working with non-vaccinated people? And that's part of what we don't know. I mean, is this truly a protective vaccination? So once I get it, I really cannot get COVID no matter what. And if that's the case, then there wouldn't really be a valid objection to working with anybody who didn't get it because you're protected from it. So, you know, again, I think you just have to go through, an employer's going to have to figure out, based on the best information possible from the CDC about the effectiveness of the vaccination, what do we do with people who come together like that? And you would, I mean, you know, a good lesson is, what am I doing right now? Are people working together and wearing face masks and distancing, and that's working out okay? Are they remote, and should I just continue doing that? You know, and you know, I want to raise also the issue of not, you got to be careful too about not retaliating against or treating badly the person who won't have it or can't have it, especially can't have it. Because if I have a medical condition and I can't have the vaccination, you can't be perceived as putting me in a closet away from everybody else to the extent that it affects my ability to do my job, you know, or even to interact with people. So it's really going to be that potentially some hard issues there about how do I deal with the people who can't or won't have it without discriminating or retaliating against those people and yet keeping a happy workplace.
It's interesting you brought that up, because just before you started saying that, this question came in: if we do not require the vaccination and leave it optional, can we have a separate policy for safety protocols and illness for those that choose not to get it versus those that do get it, or does that set us up for discrimination?
Well, I mean, I don't know that there's an easy answer to that now, because I think, again, the missing piece of that is, how protective is this vaccination? Is it 100%? Because if it's 100% and the answer is, once you get it, you are completely immune from COVID and you can't possibly get it or pass it along, because that's still an issue, then I think it would be okay to say to people who got it, you don't have to wear a face mask anymore, for instance, because you can neither get it nor convey it. But that has to be, you know, a certainty before you do that, because I've seen everything from, you can get the vaccination, but you're still going to have to wear a face mask because we just don't know, is it effective against, you know, completely and against every form, right? Because now there's that new strain going around. And so those are still unanswered questions. So it's possible that the people who have it could have some relaxed restrictions on what they're doing and, you know, sitting together in the lunchroom and things like that, but we don't know.
And what about written HR policies related to this? We've had several questions come in around, should there be a written HR policy? They're talking about having consents and declination forms, but should there be an overall HR policy regarding vaccinations?
Well, you know, it's ironic that I'm saying this, but I almost think it's too soon, because number one, we have no idea when most of us are going to even be able to get it. And number two, we don't know the effectiveness, or at least I don't. I'm sure there are people who do, but I haven't seen anything to tell me that, you know, this is the level of certainty that we have once you get this, because that's what your workplace will then depend upon. I mean, if you want to make a decision now as an employer that we are absolutely going to require everybody to have this no matter what, and you're ready to tell your employees that, and you know, you don't want to wait until it's available, then I suppose you could do that. I'm not sure that it's worth a policy, but I do think, you know, giving people notice that once this is out, we are going to require people to have it. So that would give people who have an objection to it or an issue with it time to let you know that and work it out. You know, I wouldn't be opposed to that. But again, something might change between now and when it becomes available to you too. So it's almost like, why have the fight when we're not even sure we're going to need the fight?
Interesting question from a small business owner. They write, as an essential retail establishment, a positive case would not just expose other employees and customers, it would close our doors due to exposure. We don't have the ability to allow employees to work from home. So what options would we be looking at for those that decline vaccinations?
Again, that's going to be a really case-specific question, and it may be that I need to talk to them directly, but it's the same reasonable accommodation analysis. You just go through all the steps. If there is no way to find an alternate way for that person to work, and we know that, well, but again, if everybody else is vaccinated, then what's the exposure if one person chooses not to be? So I don't really know how to answer that yet. I mean, if what they're looking for is for me to say, you might get to the point where that person has to be terminated because they refuse to have it, and you can show that they're a direct threat to others in the workplace, then maybe yes, that may eventually be a possibility. But I think there are a lot of steps between now and that point.
If we send our employees to an outside place for vaccines, can we offer to reimburse employees for the cost of the
Well, my
vaccine?
understanding is that it's going to be provided at no cost. Is that what, have you guys, that's what I've seen.
Yeah.
If it's not, and if there is a charge, then I think it's okay to offer to reimburse, as long as you're, well, depending on whether you're making it voluntary or not. I think it's like paying for the flu shot when, you know, when it comes to that. But that, just keep in mind, offering to reimburse for the payment could be considered a factor ultimately in, did you strongly encourage your people to have it? I mean, one way, you know, we've addressed that in the flu context is to say, if you have somebody come in and provide flu shots at no cost to your employees as a sort of a motivation to have it without making them mandatory, one way to make it more clear that this is in fact voluntary is to offer it to employees' family members as well. So maybe that's an option with the vaccine. If you're not making it mandatory and you don't want to be responsible for having strongly encouraged people to have it, that's one way to do it. And also making it available, for instance, on non-work time.
Right. A lot of questions here. Some of them we'll hold off and save for Dr. Jarvis. We're trying to line him up next week. Stay tuned, but keep them coming. Let's take a break from vaccines, given it's 3:27, and I know you have some other topics we want to discuss this afternoon. If you have questions related to this topic or the other topics we touch on, just post them through the Q&A or Facebook message or comment, and we'll try to get as many as we can this afternoon. So let's switch gears for a moment, Anne-Marie, and take us to a couple of other areas that you want to be sure we discuss this afternoon.
Yeah, before we do that, just one other thing. I saw a question pop up briefly about proof of vaccination. And I don't know what that proof will look like, but the EEOC statement did say it made reference to an employer being able to ask for proof of a vaccination if it's given by someone else than themselves. So apparently there is going to be such a thing, and you can request that employees provide that to you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so for the other things that have been going on in the world, first of all, there's the end of the FFCRA. As we know, that all ended on December 31st. I've gotten a lot of questions about people who had not used all of the time that was potentially available to them under that law, and whether or not it has sort of re-upped or whether there's a new version in place now. There is not. There is no new FFCRA. So under the terms of that law, if someone did not use the leave time or the family medical time, it's gone. However, one of the things that bill did that was passed last week is to say that if somebody, so it doesn't, let me be clear, it does not extend that leave. But if somebody had not used all of the leave that was available to them, an employer may still allow them to take that time up through March 31st, I believe is the deadline. And the government will extend the tax credit to the employer through that date. So in other words, you're voluntarily allowing people to take this time that they had not already taken. If they already used their FFCRA time, there isn't anything left to take. So that this would not apply. It's only if I had time remaining. So you may allow them to use it up until March 31st and still take the tax credit for that. This is entirely voluntary on the part of the employer though. So if you choose to say, if you didn't use it, you lose it, and we don't care about the tax credit and it's not worth it, or we're just not going to extend it, we've had people out too much, whatever it is, you are not required to let them use that time. But once again, my normal warning is don't pick and choose. So if you allow one to use it, you're going to have to allow everybody to use it. So just be aware of that. There is also some, I am certain there are ways, if you allow people now to use that time, that it will interact with FMLA time. But it's unclear how that actually is going to work. So we may have to get into case-specific situations to deal with that. And that would really only apply to employers who are on a calendar FMLA year, because the time available would have started again as of January 1. So then they potentially have that FMLA time separate from the unused FFCRA time. And to further complicate things and make your head spin, of course, the earned leave law went into effect as of the 1st. And so allowing them to take the unused FFCRA time, you may also now be able to run that concurrently with whatever earned leave time they have, whether it's they're earning it by the hour or whether you sort of backloaded it and made it available immediately. So there's that. And then on top of that, we did get some helpful guidance from the Department of Labor. Now, this is only applicable to some of the laws that the DOL administers, like the FMLA and the FLSA. It is not necessarily applicable to laws under the EEOC or Title VII or any of those other things that require employers to do some postings. And it's a field bulletin, which means it's a guidance by the Department of Labor to its investigators. So it's not a proclamation of law. It's not an amendment to the statute or anything, but it's helpful guidance for employers. And what it talks about is how to deal with the postings that you are required to have. Now, we mentioned this when we were talking about how to deal with the new year and handbooks and all these things that you're going to have to do with remote people. And fortunately, we gave the right answer, which we surmised, which was, if you have a workplace that is now, well, there's two categories. If you have a workplace that has some people in the workspace and other people remote, so you have both, you still have to post everything in your work site because you have people who are there. But for the people who are remote, you are now able to post them electronically. And you don't have to worry about making sure those people come into the office, once a year or whatever it is, to make sure they see these postings in a workplace where there isn't anybody working. So you are now able to post these electronically. And the same is true if you have a workspace that's completely remote now, then you don't have to put up the postings at all in an empty office, and you can make them all electronic. So there are some rules about how to do this, and there's some things that you have to be aware of, like, for instance, and it's all common sense for once. And for instance, you have to be able to show that employees had access to it and were able to actually get it. So if you have an intranet or a place on the internet where people can go, where it's your specific employer information, you can put them there. You can send them in an email to people. You just have to be able to show that the employee knew that it was coming or was aware that they got it and they actually were able to access it. So you don't want to send it in some format that you get employees working remotely say, I can't open this, or I don't know what this is, or I can't, whatever. And it also said specifically they have to have readily available access to the postings at all times. So ideally, you know, you have your own site where people can go, some page, intranet or whatever it's called, where people can go and maybe your handbook is there and these postings are there. One question that came up though is what do we do about applicants? Because as you may know, there are a few postings that very specifically say applicants must have access to them, which is odd because if you have somebody in for an interview, they're not usually going to your break room where all these postings are posted. So this actually makes it a little bit easier to deal with that. And what the bulletin said is that electronic posting is acceptable if in the hiring process, if they have readily available access to the electronic posting at all times. So you could attach it, for instance, to the application or wherever they go on your website to complete an application. If that's how you're doing them, you can have it as a separate page or, you know, at the end of the application or something like that. So it's sort of more than anything, it confirms what we thought to be true, but at least they're now telling us that that is in fact the case.
Anne-Marie, we have a lot of questions coming in for you.
Okay.
You want to take a few questions?
Yeah.
You ready? Okay. This person just needs some clarification. If an employee has a positive test on January 2nd and needs to stay home for quarantine and they have no sick time, is the employer, and they say they're a small employer, fewer than 15 employees, is the employer liable to pay for being out on quarantine?
Okay, so you said they got a positive test on, let's say, January 2nd?
Yep, and they need to quarantine and they have no sick time available.
Well, so the FFCRA would not apply to them, assuming that they weren't employed last year and they don't have any time left. I don't think the employer would have to pay them for that time out unless they have something else accrued like vacation time. However, while they're out, well, they're not working, so they wouldn't be accruing earned leave time. So it sounds like probably no, there wouldn't be a requirement to pay, but you also can't fire them. So you would have to give them that time as unpaid leave time.
Right.
And
Okay.
if they were there, if they had been there long enough to qualify and be eligible under the FMLA, if you're big enough to be to have the FMLA applicable, then you would run that as FMLA time, assuming that they actually have COVID and they have a serious health condition.
A couple of other questions related to leave. I'll stick with that topic right now. Could employers choose what type of time off we allow employees to take off for FFCRA? Example, we will support paid time off if they test positive and need to isolate, but not if they traveled out of state for personal reasons and now need to quarantine, or is it all or nothing?
Well, again, the FFCRA is not really applicable anymore because that's over. So unless they're, so let's, because that's not even, it's not really in the mix so much anymore. And it's too complicated to keep saying if they had it and they didn't use it, then they can apply. I mean, let's just get that out there. So if the FFCRA would only apply if they were eligible before December 31st and they did not use all their time. And then you can give it voluntarily and get a tax credit for that time. Other than the FFCRA, good God, the question was, what was the question? I'm sorry. It was something, do you have to give paid time? And can you do it differently depending on the reason they're out?
Right. Can we, what type of time off can we allow? For example, will we support time off?
Okay, so
got it.
Can you give different time off depending on the reason that they're out, even though the reasons are all COVID related? And the answer is probably yes, because if the only reason they're out is, let's say they had exposure to somebody who may or may not have it, even though they don't have any symptoms and they don't have a diagnosis, but they have to quarantine anyway. then it seems to me that they should be permitted to use whatever accrued time they have, if any, and then it becomes unpaid time off. If somebody is out because they're actually sick, then again, if they have FMLA, that might potentially apply. Or if they have unpaid or unused leave time, that might potentially apply. And on the off chance they were eligible for FFCRA and didn't use it, then you can apply that as well. But right now, because there's no renewed FFCRA, that was where most of the paid time was coming from, because that was what mandated the 80 hours of paid time. And that was what seemed unfair, because somebody who went out of state and then was required to quarantine, even though they weren't sick, was eligible for that paid time. But that was only because the FFCRA said that. So that once you take that out of the mix, unless there's a reason that we're not thinking of, that's not going to be necessarily paid time.
We have a couple more questions related to that. And first of all, just as a side note, you're amazing. And I don't know, we're just so lucky to have you. And
I'm worried that I'm just confusing everybody to death.
Because as an employer, this stuff can just make you, yeah. If an employee is out due to COVID, could they qualify for short-term disability if that's offered?
Possibly. It would depend on the short-term disability carrier and what their criteria are, but you could certainly assist them in applying for it to see.
And second, if an employee needs to quarantine because their spouse has COVID, would they qualify for FMLA, or only if the employee has COVID?
Well, they would qualify for FMLA if the spouse has a serious health condition. So I think it would depend on, because you can have COVID and not be super ill, right? And so you may have a positive diagnosis, but not actually be sick enough to have a serious health condition under the FMLA. So I would approach that just like any other FMLA situation. And if the person comes in and says, my spouse has COVID, I want to take time off, you could say to them, here's the certification, just like we would do in any other similar situation. Have your spouse's doctor complete this, and we'll see if you qualify for FMLA time.
Okay, good. I want to get back to the poster conversation because we had a few questions about that. You may have questions about the question, but this one just says, which poster should be included with the application?
Oh, yeah. So there's a very specific list, and I'll tell you how you can find that out. I have that in a document that, we could probably share, but you can also go to the DOL website. And in fact, even the state DOL website is very helpful, because they have a separate section about posters, and they also list the federal posters, not just the state ones. And it tells you, these are the ones that are required, these are the ones that are optional, and I'm pretty sure it mentions which ones are applicants. Off the top of my head, I can't remember which one. There are 2 or 3 that are very specific to applicants, but most are not. So if you were to take all the posters, see, here's a simple way to do it. You go to the DOL website and you look at the list and you see all the ones that say they're required or not optional. And you put all of those somewhere where even an applicant can see them, then you're good.
Okay, that was a great answer. So if we go to the DOL website and just search for posters.
There's a poster category, and it's a very helpful listing, and they update it frequently.
That's good to know. I know I need to update the posters here in the office. I'm sure I'm not alone in that.
No, everybody should do it at least once a year, just to be sure.
Yeah, New Year's a good time to do it. Oh, look at Shelly's son.
Oh,
She just put the link, just like
Oh.
magic. So there it is. Thanks, Shelly. If you have questions, we have about another 15, 16 minutes. So please send those along through the Q&A or Facebook. Again, we are lining up Dr. Jarvis with Northern Light Health, hopefully for next week. He is our scientific medical expert when it comes to COVID and vaccinations. So some of the questions that aren't employee or employment related, Anne Marie, we're going to park and save for Dr. Jarvis, which is great to have both of your expertise here. We certainly need all of it. Anything else? Do we want to talk about the earned paid leave law since that is now happening?
Sure. Why
Tell us
not?
how you really feel.
I love the earned paid leave law. I mean, it's no surprise that a lot of employers are still struggling with how to incorporate this into their existing policies. It's too early to have had any actual issues with it because unless you front loaded it, nobody's earned any time yet because nobody could have worked the number of hours necessary to earn even the first hour of earned leave time. So that's not really an issue yet. But I just can't say too many times, if you have not already assessed how this impacts your existing policies, please, please, please do that now. And hopefully you've had also some opportunity to explain to employees what this is and how it differs from your existing leave policies or how it interacts with those policies so that everybody's clear about what kind of leave they're taking and what kind of notice is going to be required, and that you've educated supervisors that they may get these notices or these intents to take leave and they need to know what to do with them.
Question, do you recommend? Go
I
ahead.
was going to say the main DOL has also been helpful in continuing to post additional interpretations. And those come out by email, and you can check their website periodically and see, because for instance, there was just one, I don't know if it was last week or the week before, about some issues specific to schools. There's one specific to municipalities. So if you, that's the first place to go, because they have a very detailed question and answer. And the one question that has come up for me that has not been addressed, well, it's been addressed, but not in the way that I think most employers would have hoped. And that deals again with the issue of employers who pay on a bi-weekly basis, which is maybe not that many, but to the extent that there are employers who do that, you need to be careful about calculating the base rate at which you will pay this leave, because you are not permitted to calculate it based on a bi-weekly basis. It must be only the week prior to the request for the leave. So you're going to have your payroll folks figure out how to separate out those 2 weeks and only come up with the base rate for the week prior to the leave.
That's good to know. Question, do you recommend blending EPL, earned paid leave, with existing PTO?
I do, because you want to make it clear unless you're willing to give people an additional 40 hours over and above your existing policy, then you're going to want to combine them and make it clear to the employees that this is, the EPL is not something over and above. And for the first 40 hours, these are the rules that apply to that time. And then after that, you can have whatever the remaining time would have been. But like, for instance, I get concerned because I see policies like, we have a vacation policy, but people can't take it until they've been with us for a full year. Well, that's fine for the vacation policy, but that's not fine for the EPL. So you can't just combine those two and say, well, you're going to get your EPL, but it doesn't go into effect for a year, because that's not right. So you need to be really careful about meeting the actual requirements of the EPL and then going on with whatever remaining time they'd have under your policy.
I know you really like math questions, so like word problems.
I like word problems. I just like the actual math part.
There's a little bit of math in this one, but I never thought about this. If you have employees who are paid commission, when you allot for the new paid time off accrual, let's say front loading 40 hours every year, would you pay minimum wage or take an average of the annual pay divided by 2080?
So the first thing I'm going to do is direct that person to the question and answers on the DOL webpage, because I'm almost certain, and I didn't bring it today because I didn't anticipate talking too much about this, but I'm almost certain that they have addressed that very specific question. I think it will depend on whether the person only receives commissions or whether they have commission plus a base salary. Because
According to
again,
the only paid commission only
Okay.
is in the situation.
because again, you're looking at what is the week prior to the leave. And so if you can calculate what commissions they were owed for that period of time, then that may be the base rate, but I think it would have to be over at least minimum wage, because otherwise that doesn't work out. I think the fallback position is if there's no way to calculate it because you don't know until the end of the year or whatever your system is, then you probably would fall back to a minimum wage calculation. But I would encourage that person to look at the actual question and answers, because I think that's there.
COVID question. Should an employee with a COVID diagnosis provide a doctor's note with a date to document they may return to the office?
Yeah, I think an employer is permitted to have something from a medical professional saying this is the return to work date, as opposed to the employee saying, because you know, any of us who have been through this, you don't know necessarily what that date is, and it may run from the date you get your test, or it may run from the date that you can figure out as your date of last exposure. So to the extent that I guess that also depends on whether the person's actually seeing a medical professional, because not everybody who has a positive COVID test is being treated medically for it. And if that's the case, then I think you probably could try to calculate it based on the CDC guidelines. So it's a certain amount of time after a positive test or after your last known exposure. And that's when you get into the 10 days and the 7 days and whatever the current assessment is. So I think if the person, if the person's being treated medically because of it, then you can ask for something from that medical professional saying this is when they can go back. If they haven't received medical treatment, they just have a positive test and fairly mild symptoms and they're just at home, then I think you would just go through the CDC's calculation.
Okay, I'm going to let you catch your breath here for a moment. If you have questions, we have a few minutes left with Anne-Marie Storey at Rudman, Winchell. But I did want to let you know, Shelly's son just texted me, and Shelly is our Director of Marketing and Events and our Zoom producer, Facebook Live extraordinaire, who is sharing with me that many of you are requesting to view this video outside of Facebook. So Shelly will format it and post it on our website by tomorrow morning, bangorregion.com. And we'll share that link through all of our social media channels and emails as well.
I do want to mention one thing also while you're looking at the other questions. The last thing I wanted to let people know about is we had some discussion a little while ago about the FMLA and whether or not telemedicine was going to count as treatment under the FMLA. And there was that sort of interim information from the DOL that would be true through December 31st, 2020, that they were going to consider it that way. So I wanted to let people know that they have also now issued an update to that saying that they are going to accept telemedicine as a form of documented medical treatment. And that's ongoing. There's no deadline on that. So, so that's good to know. And also, they've also confirmed that FMLA postings can be electronic. So in the same way that the postings we talked about earlier can be, FMLA can definitely be as well. And I don't see any reason why you couldn't send the forms to people electronically now also.
This is interesting, and I don't know if it's a question for you or not, but we've been approached by a company that offers a COVID test that could be self-administered to employees if they show symptoms or are exposed. Since we're not medical professionals, what kind of liability might we have by offering this to our employees?
That's outside of my, I mean, we'd have to talk to liability specialists and insurance professionals. And I mean, at the very bottom, the very bottom line, I would talk to your insurance company about any kind of potential liability. My initial inclination is that it seems like a very bad idea, and that that should be provided by whatever medical service has already been providing them, the CDC or the hospital or whatever the case may be. I'm not sure an employer should be getting involved in that, because if the test is not legit or there's something wrong with it, that's not, you don't want to take that on.
Good, thank you. Any other questions? We have a few minutes left. I think we've covered everything that's come in, Anne-Marie. Anything that you mentioned in the beginning that you want to be sure we remember, we take away the key points of today?
I mean, I think it's really the same as always from my perspective, and that is, you know, it makes me sound like kind of a boring person, but this is not the time to be impetuous and, you know, jump the gun and without thinking through. And everybody, you know, the vaccines sound great, and heaven forbid, I hope they're here as soon as they can possibly be here. But it takes some thought to go through this process and what you're going to do about them and how you're going to do it. So I just encourage people to make sure they do that.
And you, Rudman, Winchell, and certainly the Chamber will continue to bring you information as it develops, because this is a development.
I'm not going anywhere.
Thank you. Thank you. And along those lines, we are planning to do this again with Rudman Winchell on January 25th. So mark your calendars, 3 p.m. on the 25th. And in the meantime, I know Rudman Winchell, you have information that you send out via email, certainly the Chamber does. We'll continue to make information available as it becomes available. And just to wrap up, you mentioned some great resources. I know that we share a lot and we count on a lot, certainly the CDC, Department of Labor, you mentioned EEOC today, other good places to go for information. And I'm finding that they're doing a really good job of keeping that information current and updated.
They definitely are. I mean, it's the same ones, the DOL, the EEOC. OSHA is always a good place to go because, you know, they always have good information there. And also unemployment, because that's still an ongoing issue.
Hang on. A question. Somebody asked when we are planning the webinar with Dr. Jarvis from Northern Light Health. We're working on confirming that date and time, and hopefully we'll have that confirmed within 24 hours. So just stay tuned to Chamber announcements. You can also email me directly, deb@bangorregion.com, deb@bangorregion.com, and I can share that with you as soon as we have that confirmed. We're very fortunate to have great experts in our community who are willing to share information with you as it becomes available and as we all continue on this journey together into 2021.
Yeah, I watched Dr. Jarvis's last one and it was very, very helpful. So I encourage people to watch that as well, because they really do go hand in hand, what he's talking about and what I'm talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So we're grateful to you. Thank you again so much. I think with that, we'll wrap up. Shelley, do you want to jump in and just remind people where they can view this again? That this will be available. There she is, Shelley Sund, our Director of Marketing.
Yes, people on Facebook can view this immediately, probably a few minutes after we're done, but we will put this, due to the overwhelming request of this video, we will put this on our website and link to it. We'll send a link to all of our members, as well as share a link with Karen and Anne-Marie at Rudman. So it'll be up in the morning on our website, bangorregion.com.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
So with that, we'll wrap up, unless you have any final words for us, Anne-Marie Storey, this afternoon.
I have no final thought.
Oh, goodness. We exhausted you, I'm sure. Great. Thank you to all of you who joined us this afternoon. We really appreciate your participation and your great questions and engagement. And hopefully everybody's walking away with some new information and some helpful advice as we move forward. So.
Perfect. Thank you. Happy New Year.
Thanks, Deb.
Oh,
Thanks,
hang-
Shelley.
Hang on, one more.
Uh-oh.
Ah,
I
it
thought we
was
were
just
out.
no, easy. It was a thank you, very informative. So
I like that,
appreciate
right.
So with that, we will wrap up and we'll see you back here on the 25th of January, 3
All right.
o'clock.
Okay,
Which
Thank
is Monday, because I know it's confusing. Today's the Tuesday one, but normally they're Monday, so we're going back to that.
We'll go back to that. All right. Thank you
All right.
again.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Happy New
it.
Year.
Bye.
You too. Thanks, Karen. Bye.